Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak here today. I'll discuss learning for vision and robotics and all sorts of other interesting applications. I didn't realize all three invited speakers today would end up discussing forms of deep learning, so maybe I'll try and skew it a little bit more towards computer vision to keep it interesting. But indeed, there is this tradition and excitement in deep learning. With the other two invited speakers on the agenda today, I need not give any introduction about this or motivation, except to remind everyone how these models really have improved the performance on a variety of tasks, especially in computer vision, which is my interest in area. In object detection in particular, performance has dramatically improved in the last few years. And pretty much across the board in computer vision and many signal processing and language processing areas, we've seen this pattern, which is deep architectures. The deeper the architecture, the more training data you have, the better the performance can be. And this, at least, is empirically what we've seen in the recent years. But maybe there's a problem, right? Is there a danger here that this fully supervised data-intensive paradigm, we're just going to suddenly be overwhelmed by the need for training data? We're going to actually fall into this black hole of requiring strong supervision on every task. We need millions and millions of training points to train nets. By the time you want to do something new, you spend too much time collecting training data for that task, and the task isn't even important anymore. Many tasks are very time critical or have very few labels that are of interest to a user. And can deep learning address those? Well, I think many of you in the room know the answer to this. But indeed, it is my particular interest in this field right now. And what my group works largely focusing on this topic of how can we take advanced perceptual representations, mostly we're talking about deep architectures, and adapt them so that we can learn without requiring enormous amounts of training data on new tasks. So that's a broad theme. And actually, there's a lot of work going on in the field in general, and I'll emphasize my own lab in particular today because I have the privilege of the podium right now. And we work on a number of different aspects of this problem, how we can build systems or learn architectures to solve a variety of vision and multimodal processing tasks, even when you don't have lots of training data for each of the things that you're trying to do. So I won't really have time to talk about all of these. I'm just going to focus on the ones in red today and give you a snapshot of recent work, in particular, on learning how to do pixel-level segmentation of images when you don't have strong supervision, you only have weak labels. I'll talk a little bit about deep learning in non-IID settings, this notion of what do you do when your training data and your testing data don't come from the same distribution. How can you you can't fine-tune if you don't have very much data to fine-tune on. I'll tell you about our work on deep domain confusion. And last but not least, as the introduction referenced, I'll tell you about our latest work trying to adapt these architectures directly to drive motor policies in robotics, and that's exciting current work. So I won't have time to actually cover all of these in sufficient detail, but I'll see how far I can get through. So the first work that I'll tell you about is our recent work. This will appear at ICCV in December, on constrained neural network learning for weakly supervised segmentation. And this is work that's joint with my student Deepak Pathak and also Philip Krakenbull, who's a postdoc at Berkeley, who works with actually all of us, Jitendra, Alyosha, and myself. And here, this is the task of, or here we're interested in now learning for potentially a large number of classes how to do pixel-level segmentations of an image. instead of just labeling the entire image with tags, as many of you know, we'd like to actually identify the particular structure of object instances in a scene. Perhaps we want to infer their affordances, so a robot can manipulate or interact with them, or we have some computer graphics task of reanimating or manipulating the image. So we'd like to know this pixel is probably the chair pixel, and this pixel is probably the table, and so on and so forth. So the good news is there's been a lot of progress on this line of work from our group and from others. Indeed, over the summer, our group showed that a sort of classic approach to this problem, which we called fully convolutional networks, indeed showed that you could do end-to-end regression and learning in a deep architecture when you have an entire field of labels such as this, and just plow forward as you would expect. We have convolutional networks. Each pixel is a label. We have a label field, and we can do end-to-end regression. And I won't repeat this story. And it is trained end-to-end. So this requires, however, full supervision. That's the theme of traditional deep architectures or contemporary perceptual representation learning. So you need actually, for every pixel, labels for the categories that you're interested in learning. So you'd have a nice ground truth mask of the motorcycle and the horse and the person and all so on and so forth. This is, and what we and others have shown was that when you have this kind of well-supervised setting, indeed, the classic techniques of defining the right convolutional architecture, doing SGD, and so on and so forth, gets you good results. But as I said in the introduction to this talk, I don't want to require detailed, expensive collect the kind of ground truth that's illustrated on this slide. It takes, by one estimate, 80 seconds per image to collect that kind of data, and that's very expensive. And I don't think people are going to want to provide that level of annotation at scale to classify my new skiing videos or something like that might be of interest. Or if there's a target of interest to some analysts, they won't want to have to provide all that expensive annotation. So how do we approach this as a weak labeling problem? Well, instead of, we can see how far we can get with weak labels instead of strong labels. We assume that we only have tags on the entire image, and yet we want to recover these dense segmentations. And indeed, this is a classic approach of weak learning, where I have these cheap labels, and no one doubts that you can get them quickly, and in fact, you can get them for thousands and thousands of categories. And indeed, if I have a new category on the fly that I would like to identify, I'm happy to give you this kind of labels, these kinds of labels. And there indeed are a number of prior approaches to how you would train these architectures in a weak label setting. Multiple instance learning is a classic technique that has been employed here and was prior work to this recent effort. And it makes some very simple assumptions that get you a reasonable distance towards the solution. Basically, the assumption is you have at least one, that if you see the tag on the image, you want to believe that at least one pixel is illuminated in that image. And if the tag is absent, that no pixel takes that label. So this is this basic idea underlies many of the MIL techniques that have been developed over a decade or longer, and they can be applied here, but end up being a bit too weak in their naive form. So it's promising, but it's a very weak signal. Assuming just there's a single class, a single pixel for every foreground class in an image ends up not being a strong enough assumption for for this task. And so while people have published in this direction, and there is very interesting prior work, most of it required good initialization to get close to the solution. And some sort of ad hoc heuristics to get out of local minima. Indeed, you can look at imagine situations where this just seems silly. If I tell you there's a person and a car and background in a scene, how likely is it that this is actually going to be the ground truth configuration? But that's indeed a very feasible solution and a perhaps very appealing solution to a classic MIL approach. Indeed, we have a lot of implicit prior knowledge, somewhat heuristic, and this, in fact, what previous methods had been exploring is, probably these things are not just a single point. You'd like that your foreground objects do, in fact, have a certain expected prior spatial support. And that's the essence of the new idea that we're bringing to bear in this latest work. Your foreground objects are probably not just going to be a single point, so you'd like to have constraints on the feasible solution and optimize your CNN subject to these constraints. So the space of all the possible segmentation masks is very large, and a smaller subspace of those are the ones that actually are good segmentation masks, that actually, even without looking at the underlying image, you can say this is probably likely a segmentation mask. So, so you can frame this as a constrained optimization, and in some sense, this work takes the heuristic knowledge that previous papers had been applying to the task to get appealing solutions and formalizes this as a constrained optimization in a deep learning framework. So the simple MIL constraints can be written down directly. If you don't have the tag, if the object is not present in the image, if it's not tagged with a weak label, then you'd like there to be no pixels active for those tags. And indeed, the basic MIL constraint says there should be some foreground for each category that is tagged with a weak label for this image, but it's not necessarily just a single pixel. There's some minimum area that you'd like to see expressed in the scene, and that makes it more complicated than just the traditional MIL optimization. And indeed, there's a background constraint that says the background category, at least for the kinds of image data sets that we work with, should have a reasonable proportion in the image. You don't want degenerate solutions where essentially the background covers the entire scene or the background covers none of the scene. There's an expected distribution of background, and we can express this as well as constraints. So now the innovation is to express this as a constrained optimization. So ideally, we would like to learn a CNN that implicitly has these constraints and knows what the space of good segmentation masks is and how to find it. This is very hard to do directly. Although there may be future work in this direction, but I think just a direct attack on that at least is not a result that we have today. But what we can do, and it's fairly straightforward once you set it up as we have, is to set up a related problem with a latent distribution to represent the feasible space of segmentation masks and jointly optimize with the CNN and a constrained system on P to find good solutions. And so that's what we've done. So we end up learning a P that obeys the constraints that we're interested in and constrain that to be close to what the CNN is learning using a traditional weak learning approach. And we can show that we can jointly optimize these and get good solutions. So that's the CCNN optimization technique that we put forward in this new work, where we search jointly for solutions from the CNN which obey the underlying constraints that represent the good segmentations that we know to be characteristic of these data sources. So we can solve this. Both steps are fairly straightforward. It's easy to find a feasible P and then minimize the KL divergence between P and the output of the CNN, and you can take these steps in turn. So we optimize using block coordinate descent. Is there feedback? Shall I? Well, which microphone are you using? Okay. Okay, so that's the first main idea I wanted to get across. How can we learn pixel-level segmentation, these semantic segmentation masks, for categories where we don't necessarily have highly detailed and expensive ground truth segmentation? And indeed, the class of weak learning techniques that many people had been looking at and sort of showed promise really can get you nearly all the way, or very close to all the way, if you add constraints about what the expected distribution of support masks should be. Now, ideally, I think I'd like to learn these constraints, and that's future work, but for now, we set them by hand. And the results are quite nice. It's still a relatively efficient algorithm, and we get state-of-the-art segmentation results on Pascal. And the one cute observation that we make in this paper is that one additional hint on the overall size of the category, like which of the categories are sort of large objects and which of the categories are small objects. That simple hint actually dramatically improves the performance, like 10 points of MAP, which is, or 10% improvement on MAP, which is quite significant in this data set. So I'll refer you to the paper if you want to look at the details, but it's very promising, the kinds of results we can get from these architectures. Now, these results still obviously can improve from spatial refinement, and this model doesn't have, for example, a CRF layer on top of it, so there is additional future work that I don't have time to really talk about. And again, if you're interested, the code and the paper is available for that. So that was this first idea in this theme of adapting perceptual representations. How do we learn in a weak labeled setting? The next one I want to go through briefly is how do we, in general, tackle this problem of learning with perceptual representations, including deep perceptual representations, when you've got a non-IID setting, when you might have training data from Amazon, and yet I have a robot flying around my lab, and I'd like to recognize, chairs and obstacles and things like that. And anyone who's actually done this work in the real world knows that the distribution of things you see in your lab never exactly matches the distribution of things that you see in the world. And so now I'm going to tell you about another INCCV paper we have, simultaneous deep transfer across domains and tasks. And this is work that both employs or solves domain adaptation problems and task transfer problems in a deep setting. So indeed, we'd like robots to learn from the web and act in the real world. But we know data set bias exists. This is a famous slide from Alyosha Efros and Antonio Torralba, this great paper they cooked up while they were stranded in France or something after the Iceland volcano. And maybe to a computer vision audience, this is a little more of an inside joke, but they basically put up this poster and they said, look at all of our data sets. I'll bet you can guess which data set is which block of 3 images up there. And indeed, most of the practitioners in the field could go up and say, oh yeah, that's Caltech 101, that's UIUC cars, I've been looking at those images for 20 years or whatever. And in fact, I think it was Svetlana who who got all of them right? So there were one or two practitioners who, but really the ones who actually published the best work ended up knowing all of the data sets. But this is a problem, because if you really can predict, if you really can identify the data set just by looking at it, you know there's bias, perhaps not even a subtle bias, in what you learn when you train on that data set. So their paper was really raising this issue and identifying it to the vision community. It's certainly not an unknown problem in machine learning in general, but I think vision researchers had not paid enough heed to it. And so this illustrates the problem, this game that they had people play. It also points to a solution, at least one of the solutions we're quite fond of. So the solution is actually to try and play the game and lose. You'd like representations that can't play the name the data set game, but still can do well on the tasks of interest. And that's a theme, I think, of contemporary work in this space, where we're trying to learn representations which are invariant to cross-domain properties and can't actually classify domain, but can still do well on the underlying tasks. And hopefully this learns representations where domain shift is going to be less of an issue. So we have a new paper, a new technique that we call deep domain confusion, actually combining two ideas. It combines this idea that I've just articulated of domain invariance. We call it maximizing the domain confusion. You'd like to learn a representation that actually can't predict the domain labels in multiple data sets that you're working on. And at this, and at the same time, also tries to exploit the structure within each domain of class distributions. In other words, the underlying manifold of appearance relatedness between categories. Cups look more like bottles, cars look more like buses, and so on and so forth. So we have this architecture that includes several elements, including different losses for these different aspects. Let me try and use the soft laser pointer here. Here we have a traditional deep architecture for each domain, a source domain and a target domain. And we have tide weights between them. And we have a standard classification loss that certainly will be penalizing you for performing poorly on your source tasks. And there'll be many labels in your source domain. But in your target domain, there will be many categories for which you have no labels, and perhaps no category for which you have a lot of labels. Whatever labels you have, you'll also have a loss. But again, we're interested in the setting where you move into a new domain and you have potentially no labels at all, or just a few labels on a few anchor categories. And the two ideas we're exploring here are, first, add this notion of domain confusion, which we realize in this work by first predicting first training a predictor to try and play the name the dataset game. In other words, a loss that says, please try and predict the domain label. And then alternatively, penalizing the cross entropy of that, of those predictions, saying, actually, we don't want these things to be able to do a very good job. So we, through this optimization, encourage a representation where a predictor cannot actually tell the difference between these domains. That's one idea. That's the domain confusion idea. And the transfer of task correlation idea is, in essence, revisiting the dark knowledge concept that Jeff Hinton expressed, but bringing it to a domain adaptation or transfer learning setting where we can exploit the fact that there are these latent correlations in activations across categories that are richer sources of transfer between new categories. So if we know that bottles and cups are correlated in the source domain, and we can discover that from the source domain, where we see that when I train models on bottles, there's actually significant activation from these other related categories. We can train that, we can bring that across to the target domain and create virtual training labels even for categories where I have no training data. So I might have a few anchor categories, maybe bottle and bus, but I don't have any labels for cup and car. But indeed, I can get some virtual labels knowing that I'd like to see the same activation pattern across categories for these categories of interest. So that's this transfer part of the idea. So the full model that we put forward includes all of these elements and shows significantly improved performance. We've been evaluating both on data sets where we have examples of categories collected across different domains, some that we collect in sort of office-like environments or something that a robot might encounter, and others where it's collected from Amazon or web sources. And just to illustrate the performance of the algorithm, indeed, after you add this domain confusion loss, the method is no longer, the domain classifiers are no longer able to tell the difference, right, between the domains. So this is evidence of increasing domain invariance in the architecture, and yet performance is maintained despite this optimization and does quite well. And the soft label transfer, the task correlation transfer does also improve performance and often remove confusion. For example, here this object would have been mischaracterized as a ring binder because perhaps in the Amazon imagery that it was trained on, it did look more similar to a ring binder. But here it knows that actually it doesn't, there's some related category to monitor for which we had in target domain training data, so that classifier was actually pretty good, and it knew that this image didn't look enough like that for it to actually be a ring binder, and it gets the right answer. So in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip the previous slide and just show this slide where we do have a quantitative analysis of performance and show that indeed these methods, each component of the method improves performance. And even if you have no target domain for any category, we certainly improve performance over the baseline of just using the source networks, and you can get a significant boost in performance either by adding the confusion idea or the task transfer idea, or both. And you're also welcome to look at our upcoming ICCV paper, which is on archive. So I think I'm somewhat on time, which is encouraging. And that leads me into this last part of the talk, which is in some sense the most preliminary and exciting, because a lot of things are in motion, and that's both in terms of the intellectual progress and the actual research, because it's how can we take these classes of perceptual representation learning architectures, these deep architectures, convolutional neural networks, and use them for action in the real world. And this is a collaboration with my colleague at Berkeley, Peter Abil, and also Sergey Levine, who's a postdoc, and I think also at Google and soon to be at UW, and our graduate student, Chelsea Finn. And I'm sure you all know the basic story of why this would be cool. There's lots of robots in the world, and we would like to make them do things. And I think, as a vision person, that one of the reasons they don't do as much as they should is we still really haven't solved the robot vision problem, which many of us entered the field because we thought we were going to solve it, and we've been sidetracked with internet vision, which is very valuable and profitable, and much. You don't actually need a laboratory to do it. That's why it's exciting. You just need a laptop and a cluster somewhere, whereas robots are messy and complicated. But they're doubly complicated because not only do you have to solve vision, but you have to solve control to do important things in the robot action space. And both of them are hard. They're probably doubly hard put together. And our conjecture is that the reasons we've made such progress in computer vision in the last 5 or so years through these new classes of techniques that jointly optimize over the representation and the classifiers, for lack of a better term, that will also help robotics, this combination of perception and action, where we really don't know the right way to plug these things together. We can barely solve each problem in and of itself. And so we're excited about exploring the frontier of how deep architectures can help robotic control. There are lots of different robotic control problems, state estimation, optimal control, and it's actually not a the idea of applying neural networks for control is, of course, very appealing. We all know we'd like to take a patch of pixels and figure out how to map them to actions in the world, perhaps directly to torque or end effector parameters. And it's not a new idea to directly take neural networks and do this. In fact, it's almost as old as convolutional neural networks themselves, this idea of taking a multi-layer perceptron or a early deep architecture and trying to map directly from pixels, for example, pixels of a road, to control parameters for an autonomous vehicle. The early work by Dean Pomeroy in the Alvin system is probably the earliest example of this, although you never know when you say something like that on stage. And we're all, of course, very excited by and familiar with the event-based architectures that couple perception and action, and these very exciting deep reinforcement learning techniques that we're able to, with very simple architectures and but powerful learning techniques, learn to play video games. Now, the question is, can we actually take this kind of architecture, at least the last, so the Alvin work did run in the real world for a period of time, I believe. But can we take these general learning architectures that work across a wide variety of tasks, such as the deep Q-learning class of techniques, and make them work on real physical robots? And that's what we've been trying to do at Berkeley, and I'll show you some of the results that we have. So we'd like to learn policies that directly map images and internal proprioception, knowledge of the robot's configuration, to output torques. So we'd like to map observations through a policy to action, and we're going to be exploring and have explored deep neural network architectures for these policies. And these are not going to look very different at first glance than the architectures we've been using for other tasks, for classic vision tasks. There's one or two important differences that I'll point out. But basically, it's a convolutional architecture. We'd like to figure out how to extract features and representations. But instead of mapping them through convolutions and poolings and ReLUs to 1,000 categories of ImageNet, or pixel labels in images, I'd like to actually map them to motor controls so that I know when I see this configuration of a target, I should actually move the arm this way. So one interesting, so let me actually just, so one interesting aspect of this, of the architecture we have explored here, that both reduces its dimensionality, which is important because it goes without saying, but I should say it very explicitly. The hard part of this endeavor, as we move from classic computer vision challenges to action and reinforcement learning challenges, is how do we learn deep architectures, which require normally enormous amounts of training and normally require enormous amounts of training in a fully supervised setting. How do we make them work in settings with delayed reward? So the robot is going to do things, and it's not going to actually get feedback until the end of its sequence. So that's the essence of a reinforcement learning problem. And so the direct application of deep learning doesn't necessarily work. You don't have millions of training examples to train your network. So first, it's desirable to have networks of modest complexity, if you can. Second, as we start to explore tasks, both in vision and in robotics, where affordances are our goal, doing things or manipulating objects, or knowing their pose in particular, it's now perhaps the position of features more than the presence of features, or in addition to the presence of features, that are important. So we may not just want to spatially pool everything. We may actually want to do what a traditional vision architecture might have done, which is find the locations of things in the image that are interesting. So the one key difference in this work between the normal convnet and this Visuomotor convnet is we actually have an what I call an argmax layer, not just a normal max pooling layer, but it's or a spatial softmax layer. But basically, it returns the position of the maximum response, in addition or instead of the size of the maximum response. Now, these kinds of things had been used in deconvolutional networks and other architectures, but I think it's a novel use here for, in essence, pose prediction or action prediction. Because of this, the final fully connected layers are actually have fewer parameters than the traditional architectures. And I think it also enables the network to have more spatial sensitivity to position. So how do we train this? We need to learn this under a policy. And so far, I've just told you that there's a argmax layer instead of a regular max pooling layer. So I still need to train it with trajectories of performance and hope that it'll generalize to new settings. So the first work that we've done in this direction, which we reported at ICRA last year, solve this problem under certain assumptions, and I'll relax those assumptions in a few slides. The first assumptions those assumptions that we initially adopted were knowledge of the target coordinate or target pose of an object in the scene. So this might be done by having the robot hold it in its hand, or perhaps you just know its position through some other tracking means. A significant assumption, yet a reasonable one for many robotics tasks. And that allowed the following approach, which said, let's use a traditional policy control algorithm to generate trajectories that get me from a known initial condition to my known target state without even looking at the camera. But I can do that for a variety of initial conditions. And I can see what the observations would have been for those trajectories. And now these trajectories give me ground truth for direct policy learning in a deep Visuomotor sense. And then at test time, you relax the assumption. You don't actually, of course, need to know the configuration of the target. If you know the configuration of the target, that's too easy. So we use that assumption just to generate training data, and then at test time, the object is unconstrained. Oops, I shouldn't have done that. Let me back up. OK, so this will show you, hopefully, a video of of the PR2 trained under this regime, learning to do what any 1-year-olds or 2-year-old can do, which is insert things into objects. But heretofore, the sort of complexity of the environment was a bit much for traditional techniques, and indeed the ability of a single algorithm to generalize to multiple tasks is one of the things we're most excited about. So we've shown inserting blocks in a block sorter, assembling Legos, putting coat hangers on coat racks, and hammering plugs, screwing in bottles, removing nails from things, and indeed the behavior being shown here, where the person was perturbing the environment and the robot was still sort of following along, is the kind of emergent behavior that wasn't programmed or even demonstrated to the robot, but the control algorithms ended up just having a natural resilience of that form, and that's one of the things that I personally think is very cool. But I said that for training in this first set up, we assumed we knew the pose of the target. That's how we generated the training data in a fully supervised setting. That's not feasible in general. So our latest work, which is, has just been submitted and I think is on archive, explores this in a more unsupervised setting. So how can we learn a representation just based on the robot's initial explorations of the environment and use that representation to learn a policy. So it's an unsupervised counterpoint or variant to the previous technique where the robot first kind of flails around in the environment, but that gives the robot visual experience from which it can use an autoencoder to learn a visual representation. And then we run supervised learning in that space and get it to work. We use the same structure of our Visuomotor controller. It's just now the bottom layers are going to be learned with an autoencoder. And right now, actually, I think they're just learned in an unsupervised fashion. There's not a great deal of backpropagation into the model, into the lower layers of the model, the convolutional layers of the model. That's obviously future work. And here you can see, and what you do get, or the way it is trained, is after this period of initial exploration, learning a visual representation, you give it just an image, or you just show the robot the desired end state of the task, and it uses that to figure out how to optimize a policy to get it to the task. So in this, again, we've tried a variety of tasks that would have been too difficult for the previous method, some of which would have been too difficult for the previous method, such as scooping objects or whatnot. Let me just show videos at this point, given the lack of time that I have. Oops, I don't need that. How do I turn that off? Sorry. Okay, that worked. So you can see this is sort of flailing around to learn the visual representation, and eventually it learns both a representation and a policy to perform a task. So that was pushing a Lego block. There we go. That's if you never use vision, and this is if you do use vision. It gets it right to the goal configuration. Here's transferring a bag. If you don't have some sort of visual feedback, it's very hard to perform this task based only on end effector coordinates. And let me jump to the last video here. This is a nice video which shows the positions of the features that were learned and how they relate between intermediate configurations and the final configuration. And there are very few assumptions on these features. So a computer vision person would, like myself, says, but there's so much more knowledge I could put on this problem, and we haven't done that yet. And here's just one more video showing the how do I turn off this pointer now? That's how I do it. It's just showing from start to finish, learning the scooping behavior. It can't scoop it at all when it first starts. Eventually, it starts to get it right. This is a video that's been sped up 6 times. So you can see, eventually, it's sort of, I mean, it's kind of like how a little baby might learn a task like this through trial and error. And so that's quite interesting. In the end, it gets it right reliably. Okay, so there's still a lot of work in this space. This is very early. 2 big areas are multitask generalization in deep reinforcement learning. I think there's been very little work on that, either in the work that we've done or in other work that's been reported. And learning from demonstrations, so you actually show you kind of show a whole trajectory, or you even show a trajectory with a different manipulator, like your own hand, and have the policy learned from that. And if you're interested in this, please contact any of us on the project, or there is an archive that I don't have linked here, but you can find it from that web page, I'm sure. So those are the 3 things I wanted to tell you about today in this grand overview perspective of how do we adapt networks so that we can learn without enormous amounts of detailed training data, both for image segmentation, for adapting across domains, from the web to the robot environment, and finally, how do we go forward and actually make the robot, drive the robot using integrated end-to-end architectures that map from pixels to motions. Before I close, I want to put in a plug for a new effort we're starting at Berkeley on the intersection in particular of deep learning and automotive applications, autonomous driving, and even transportation more generally. And we have a bunch of great sponsors who are going to launch this with us. And if you are interested in also becoming a great sponsor who wants to launch this with us, please come talk to me about that. With that, I will thank you for your time. And I've just used up all the time.
Thank you, Trevor. I think we cannot let you go without a single question, so we do have a little bit of time. Please.
In the back.
On the back.
With the weak labeling, have you said any sort of like multiple instances of the same class, how to make that work right, or does it like work right out of the box if you have, if that's like the label human in the scene and you have 4 distinct humans, it seems that it gets that right?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. I mean, the algorithm definitely does have to learn across multiple images, multiple instances of the same class to learn that. It doesn't, however, learn subcategories of human types or discover them.
So it doesn't. If like the image has the label human for the whole image, and there are multiple inside.
So that's right. Yeah, this is just what we call a semantic segmentation task, which is computer vision speak for labeling pixels as if they were texture. It doesn't do a detection task or an instance identification task, again, which would mean saying there are 3 separate humans. This is just labeling each pixel as human stuff, humanness.
Yeah.
And there is work on that, but nothing I have to report today.
Thanks.
All right. In the interest of time, we should continue our program. Let's thank Trevor again.